Thank you all for joining us this evening, especially because of the weather. This is our first lecture in our second Sherwood Speaker Series. I'm Megan Bever, for those of you who don't know me. I am Vice President of the Sherwood Raider Farm Civil War Park and Associate Professor of History here at Missouri Southern. This speaker series is presented by the Sherwood Raider Farm Civil War Park, which interprets the May 18, 1863 engagement between Federal soldiers and Confederate partisans that left many black Union soldiers dead. The park also seeks to foster an understanding of the border conflict that raged along the Missouri-Kansas border during the war, and to promote the preservation of battlefields and historic sites. We hope that you'll take the time to learn more about the park by visiting our Facebook page. We also hope that you will mark your calendars for our second and third lectures, weather permitting. On January 27th, we will have Jeremy Neely of Missouri State. He is presenting Robert Van Horn's Civil War, Loyalty and Freedom and the Evolution of the Border West. And on February 24th, we will have Jennifer Murray of Oklahoma State, and she will be presenting Preserving and Interpreting America's Most Iconic Battlefield, Gettysburg. This series would not be possible without the work of Bob Harrington, President of the Raider Farm Park Board, and Paul Tevereau and Virginia Lass, who serve on the organizing committee. In addition to support from Raider Farm's Board of Directors, we are also grateful to Missouri Southern for partnering with us to host this event. Specifically, we would like to thank Brad Belk, Missouri Southern's community historian, and Brad Hodson, the Executive Vice President and Executive Director of the Missouri Southern Foundation. Our first speaker is Isaias J. McCaffrey, who earned his PhD in history from the University of Kansas in 1999. He is also a 1987 graduate of Missouri Southern. McCaffrey is Professor of History at Independence Community College and Adjunct Professor of History at Southern New Hampshire University. His recent research interests include racial and ethnic communities in the Southern Plains, including the Osage Nation, Low German-speaking immigrants, and Greek Americans. His lecture tonight is entitled The Civil War from an Osage Wajaji Perspective. Please join me to welcome him.
Oh, it's going to take a minute. There we go. Okay. Looking at this space, I guess I could stay up here. I was going to say that if the clicker worked, I can actually kind of move forward, but the main thing is not to step off into the chasm here, but I think I've remembered not to do that. This topic, as Megan explained, looks at the Osage and their experience during the American Civil War. If you know something about Native Americans, really, and not just the Civil War, but multiple conflicts in American history, you know that it's commonplace that Indian peoples are often caught between warring sides, all the way back in the colonial era, in which often different colonial powers would, in effect, force Native Americans into sort of the position of working as mercenaries or proxies for one combatant or the other. And the Osage are in a kind of uniquely vulnerable position with the outbreak of the Civil War. And so I'm going to start, I guess, by backtracking a little bit and talking about sort of Osage origins and how you get to the point of bleeding Kansas moving into the 1860s and the Civil War really forcing the Osage to make a decision about what the position of their people is going to be. Hey, the clicker works. The Osage are Southern Siouan, Vegia Siouan peoples, originally in what we would call sort of the High Middle Ages. They have a homeland in the Ohio River Valley, and it's not exactly understood why the Osage and related peoples began migrating westward. Some people suggest it's the breakup of the Mississippian culture, the mound builders who built Cahokia. And recently I was actually down in Oklahoma and visited the Osage Nation and the Kaw Nation, which is a little bit further west. And both the Osage and the Kaw today claim that they may have some kind of historical affiliation with Mississippian culture, and that's kind of debated back and forth. But you can see that you have this track westward. The Quapaw goes south into Arkansas. The Osage primarily are centered in Missouri. The Kaw, who are a smaller branch, head out into Kansas. And then the Omahas and the Poncas headed northward into Nebraska and up into the Dakotas. And so these are all related Siouan peoples. That migration westward obviously affected the people already living in this part of the Midwest. Oops, wrong way. Midwest and Southern Plains. And so here you see Caddoan-speaking peoples who are being displaced by that migration. The Wichitas, who had lived near present-day Wichita at the time of Coronado and the conquistadors, they wind up down in Texas. So you have kind of the Osage and related peoples moving westward and pushing some of these other Native American people in different directions as they gain predominance. And so ultimately you have the period which is referred to as the Osage Empire. And during the 1700s up to about 1800, that's a period of kind of maximum Osage power. And you can see they control a vast area of Missouri and Kansas, parts of Oklahoma and Arkansas. They also ranged over a larger area. And one of the things that happens with the Osage and some of their relatives is they go from kind of a woodland culture back east to being more sort of woodland people who adopt a lot of plains Indian culture. And the Osage, the Kaws, and others engage in buffalo hunts out in what's now western Kansas and the Oklahoma Panhandle in that area on a regular basis. So they, probably with the coming of the horse and other influences, the Osage move westward, and they kind of fit into that culture of the Southern Plains more. This is, of course, the period in which Louisiana Territory is still owned by France, and there are surviving letters and documents that talk about the Osage at the height of their powers. Their population would have been over 20,000, which is a lot for that time period. And for example, the governor of Louisiana, Bienville, he writes in his letters complaining about the Osage, how insolent they are, that this is supposed to be French territory. The Osage never, they regarded the French as allies, as kind of valuable associates to acquire technology. But Bienville complains that when French traders would go up the rivers in their canoes, much of the time the Osage would simply take what they wanted, not always pay for it. They regarded these as gifts. Thank you very much. In some cases, the Osage would learn that the French were planning to go further north to trade with the Oto or Missouri or other peoples, and they would say, no, you're not allowed to trade with them. You can just trade with us, and again, we'll take whatever you have. So the Osage are really at the height of their imperial powers. They are kind of a military colossus. Everyone has to treat them with kid gloves, and they're clearly not. If you'd told an Osage person that the King of France controls this land, they would have laughed at you. That's preposterous. So I always tell my students that when you look at old colonial maps that show, the giant vast area of Louisiana and New France, that's kind of a notional idea that this is really controlled by France. So then you have the shrinking of that Osage domain. Large areas in Missouri and Arkansas are lost in 1808 by treaty. And the Osage moved west to the border, the Missouri border region near the Osage River for a time. And then in 1825, again, large territories in Kansas, Missouri, down into Oklahoma, a little piece of Arkansas are also lost. And so the Osage are shrinking in terms of their territory. That's a direct byproduct of shrinking numbers of Osage and their military muscle. And not surprisingly, the biggest factor in the diminishment of Osage power and demographics is exposure to European diseases. And so later on, I've got a slide that shows the decline in population, which is massive. Here we go. I guess was the next slide. You can see the population in 1790s around 20,000 or so, and then you march forward in time, and those numbers progressively crash. And so by the outbreak of the Civil War, there's approximately 4,500 Osage left. And then you can see after the war, and then up to 1906, down below 3,000. And in fact, during the Civil War, you had outbreaks of measles and smallpox that killed hundreds of people. And part of that is the increasing numbers of settlers. that are moving into Osage lands legally or illegally. So contact with people who are the bearers of European origin diseases. And then also the contraction of Osage territory. These were people who ranged over wide territories traditionally and would not stay in their villages for extended periods. Once that mobility begins to disappear, people are staying longer in one place, and that results in problems like cholera and other diseases that are a result of sanitation. So there's a direct relationship between sort of Osage power and ability to hold on to the land and basically fight for their interests and the shrinking population. So this is a map from roughly 1840, and it shows the location of the Osage at that point in time. They've been forced out of Missouri, and you see most of their villages are clustering along the Neosho River to the east, and then the Verdigris River to the west. And so that's kind of where the Osage are primarily living at the time of the outbreak of the Civil War. And starting in the 1840s, some of the first white settlers begin to settle in southeastern Kansas. And many of those individuals are associated with the Osage Mission, which is in modern St. Paul. So you had a Protestant mission among the Osage that kind of failed. The Catholics, the Jesuits, do better. And that's in part because the Osage had been allies of the French, had already been exposed to Catholicism earlier, found, I think, the Jesuits and the Catholics to be more compatible than some of the Protestants who tried to convert them. One of the earliest people to live among the Osage is this gentleman, John Matthews. Originally from Virginia, he lives in Kentucky and then settles in southeast Kansas. And he ran basically a shop. He's a trader, and also he's a blacksmith. And coming out of the South, he's also ardently pro-slavery. And so the Osage had a name for him, Monsegahe, which meant metal maker, and providing metal technology to the Native Americans gives him a lot of influence. He's an important person to the Osage. And he's one of these people, when we move into the 1850s, who is advocating for a pro-Southern, anti-slavery position for the Osage Nation. He becomes involved in a lot of the bushwhacking and fighting that goes on in that corner of Kansas. He leads his own group of armed men in conflict with Free State anti-slavery forces, and his home was attacked. One of his barns was burned down. And there's a cycle in the 1850s of violence and revenge, which is common to Missouri as well. Both sides just go at each other, and eventually there's not much left. That happens in southeast Kansas. And Matthews is married to a mixed-blood Osage woman. That gives him entree into the Osage Nation. He's regarded by them as a member of the tribe. By the way, he also was married to another woman. He had 2 wives. Actually, to the Osage, that didn't matter. That was a typical pattern. Many Osage men had 2 or more wives, and partly that's because the mortality among men was much higher than women, partly due to war and violence, but also probably other factors as well. So there was sort of always an imbalance in terms of gender among the Osage. So Matthews is someone who is ultimately going to be advocating that the Osage support the Confederacy. Another individual that's very important is Andrew J. Dorn. He's from Tennessee. Can anybody guess what J stands for as a Tennessean? Jackson. Andrew J. Dorn is the United States Indian agent to the Osage. So he's a federal employee, but he's a Southerner. So he's going to flip. So you have these 2 figures then. Dorn is actually friends with many of the people who later on are in support of the Union. So you get the impression that among the Anglos that they're torn apart, that these relationships that were positive turn murderous later on. So it's kind of the typical story of bleeding Kansas. But Dorn is supposed to be a representative of the United States government, and it turns out that he is an enemy of the United States government. And so there's a big debate among the primary authors of Osage history who are Osage themselves. John Joseph Matthews wrote like a 1,200-page tome, A History of the Osage Nation, and then Lewis Burns writes the other major Osage history. And both of them sort of make the point that the United States, early during the Civil War, the Union sort of was slow to interest itself in Indian territory and Native Americans on the Southern Plains, that basically the United States kind of bungled or even withdrew, that it pulled troops to kind of shore up its position in Missouri and further east. And at least some of these authors say that the Union kind of abandons the Osage. I'm not really sure that that's fair. I think that part of the problem is that on the ground, federal officials happen to be pro-Southern. So basically the Federals have to come back and rebuild, have to get a new Indian agent. But there may be some argument that given the priorities early in the Civil War that maybe Native Americans in Indian Territory and in Kansas don't seem that important when you're worried about losing the state of Missouri to the Confederacy. So maybe there were priorities in terms of what they do. The most prominent anti-slavery figure is also the primary Jesuit priest at the Osage Mission in St. Paul's, Kansas. He is a Belgian Jesuit, and so his actual real first name is probably Jan, and then Schoenmakers in Flemish. People in Kansas probably said shoemaker, and in fact you sort of see it written that way. So that's a direct translation. Father Schoenmakers counsels the Osage basically to not support the Confederacy. He told them that slavery was immoral, and the Osage referred to African Americans as Nika Sabe, the black ones, and all the sources tend to agree that at the beginning of the conflict over slavery, that the Osage are confused. They don't understand sort of the politics of sectional dispute. They don't understand what the problem is, or actually multiple authors will say that the Osage were appalled that when they saw white people killing each other over the issue of slavery, that the Osage would never do this to each other. It's like, we don't understand how you can turn on your own. So in any event, Father Schoenmakers is a target for the pro-slavery forces. His life is threatened. He's forced to flee the mission for like 8 months when there's a conspiracy afoot to kill him, and apparently some of the Osage tipped him off and he got out in time. But the person who follows him in St. Paul at the mission was an Italian priest, Paul Ponzilione, and when pro-slavery men, led by Matthews, show up at the mission, they literally point pistols in his face. He's a priest, apparently the Osage, who I think they didn't become Orthodox Catholics by any means, but they had personal relationships with the Catholic priests. And really, these men had lived with them for years, had nursed them when they were sick. They say that Father Schoenmakers he's the person, he's like the among all the Anglos who lived among the Osage, he had a better command of the Osage language than like anyone ever. Apparently, he literally got native fluency. And so when his life is threatened and when these gunmen show up and they treat these priests with disrespect, some of the Osages at least begin to turn in the direction of favoring the Union and against the cause of slavery. But the majority probably don't know what to do, and there's this period of indecision. And that creates an opening. Once the war breaks out in 1861, the Confederacy sends Albert Pike, who's ultimately Confederate general. I think at that point in time, he probably has the rank of like captain or major. He's not a general yet, but Pike is someone who is made Indian commissioner and given the job of recruiting as many Native Americans as he can possibly get to join the Confederate cause. And so through Matthews and others, Pike basically recruits all of the major Osage chiefs and band chiefs and principal chiefs to come down to Tahlequah, the Cherokee capital, in Indian Territory for a grand council. And they go. The Osage, again, most sources agree, don't really understand the politics of the Civil War, but they understood being invited to a feast and to a dance. And they're always up for that. The Osage show up. Apparently they put on their best dance paint and their fanciest clothings and headdresses. And the Osage physically were often large, well over 6 feet tall. So these men show up, all dressed up and painted, and apparently made a big impression. They were treated with, probably respect and maybe some trepidation by the people there, and they liked that. But Pike is very effective at showing great courtesy and respect, which the Osage appreciate. He also gets the Cherokee who are at Tahlequah, those who are pro-slavery, to counsel the Osage to join, to sign a treaty with the Confederates to become an ally of the Confederacy. And ultimately, at least early in the Civil War, a majority of these chiefs are swayed. They do sign a treaty with the Confederacy to become allies. It's been pointed out that the Confederates, in their treaty with the Osage, it's the only treaty where they actually promise, they use the words basically, that the Osage can keep their land as long as the sun shines and the grass grows, that kind of language. Federal treaties that never kind of make that ironclad guarantee. But I think that the fact that more acculturated, more sophisticated Cherokees are willing to sign up with the Confederacy. Also, the Osage were told that the principal Cherokee chief, John Ross, was a staunch advocate of the Confederacy. Of course, he's not. Later on, he becomes neutral. So there may be some trickery involved in saying, oh, well, Ross is with us, you should be too. So, again, the majority of the Osages sign on the line and become allies of the Confederacy. One of the principal advocates of the Confederacy for the Cherokee Nation is Stan Watie. He's later reaches the rank of brigadier general, and he's going to recruit at least a couple hundred Osage warriors that will ride with him early in the Civil War. And apparently he's one of these figures who convinces many of the Osage who are wavering to side with the South. Here you have, though, the Osage chiefs who are in the minority who disagree. Hardrope or Wahisaki, that's a gentleman I wrote my article about in Kansas History last year. Chitopa, Strike Axe, these are all band chiefs who are influential men. And we also have Little Bear. Couldn't find a photo of him. It's probably somewhere, maybe the Osage Museum has one, but these individuals are not convinced by Albert Pike and by the presentations of the pro-Confederates. They refused to sign the treaty. They apparently mounted their horses and rode northward. And so Strike Axe actually joins a federal unit and fights during the Civil War as a soldier. The other two, they don't join the Union Army, but they make contact with Union forces. The Kansas 9th Cavalry was stationed up in Humboldt, and Chitopa and Hardrope and other allied Osage leaders basically make contact with Union forces and express their sympathies for the Union cause, and they become kind of an informal buffer zone. They begin screening the border with Oklahoma or Indian Territory that's held by the Confederates, and they're sort of an early warning system for Union forces that are up in Kansas whenever raiders or other Confederate scouts, people like that, come northward. So here's a map in 1860 that shows you the Osage Diminished Reserve. Notice that Crawford and Cherokee counties have already been taken away, so those are full of settlers. What becomes Labette and Neosho County, they are subject to kind of an invasion of unauthorized settlers in this period. And so the bulk of the Osage are forced out of the Neosho River Valley westward into what's now Montgomery County and the fringes of Labette County. So that's kind of the situation as the war opens. Initially, you have some Confederate successes raiding into Kansas. Stan Watie and his Confederates raid as far north as Humboldt. Humboldt was also raided earlier by gunmen from the area around Chitopa, Kansas. In retribution for that, John Matthews, the trader and blacksmith, he's actually gunned down and killed. He's a casualty. You get the impression during the first part of the war that everybody suffers. The town of Chitopa was settled before the Civil War by a party of Quakers who came from Iowa. Quakers, Society of Friends, are anti-slavery. Their houses are basically all burned down. They're forced out. So the original founders of Chitopa, many of them become refugees, but many of the pro-slavery people, their houses are burned down in retribution. So you get the sense of kind of a no man's land. The Osage, in the early parts of the Civil War, are still going on their buffalo hunts twice a year. They would plant their crops, corn and beans and squash, and then they would go to western Kansas and hunt buffalo for weeks and then return. And what they found is that the Confederates and pro-Confederate people were burning and destroying their crops. That's not a great way to make friends. You come home and your villages have been ransacked and your crops have been destroyed. And so there's kind of a slow progression of the Osage changing sides. By 1863, the Confederate cause in the West is in very bad shape. Grant's army is closing in on Vicksburg. Much of the Ozarks has fallen to federal forces. And I think that during that period of time, the pro-Union band chiefs are working on their initially pro-Confederate counterparts and slowly converting them. It's also said that regardless of which side you're on, that the Osage would never initiated violence with each other. That if pro-slavery or pro-Confederate Osage encountered pro-Union people, they would simply turn around and go in different directions. But unlike the Cherokee and certain other people where they did engage in serious violence, the Osage didn't do that. So there's not really the kind of the blood being shed that would have permanently divided them. And I would give the pro-Union band chiefs sort of credit for refusing to let the Civil War divide the Osage people. They're like, we are still one nation regardless of which side politically for now you're on. And so you get the impression that the Osage in general see politics, Anglo-politics, as much less important than their own internal community cohesion. And also, politics is something that you can change, you can flip. So as events begin to shift against the South, that's when more and more Osages begin to change their allegiance. And so General Edmund Kirby Smith is a commander in Arkansas, a beleaguered commander, and he makes a decision to send an expedition west. 22 Confederate officers are going to be dispatched westward across Kansas with the goal of linking up with pro-Confederate forces that are believed to be out in Colorado and New Mexico. I recently read, it's a history of Colorado during the Civil War. Actually, there were some pro-Confederate people laying low, apparently out in Colorado. Not enough to change the course of the war. This is an absolute desperation measure. I think they're dreaming, thinking, they also thought that maybe the Plains tribes, the Cheyenne and Arapaho and Kickapoo and others, might be turned into Confederate Indians. I think that's not likely either at this point. So it's really sort of a Hail Mary throw to try to get some help for the Confederacy. So Smith sends Colonel Charles Harrison. Notice I've cut off his face. That's actually not a picture of Harrison. That's a generic picture of a Confederate officer. There are no good images of Harrison. He's kind of a little bit of a mystery figure, but I think I've figured out his background. The name Harrison, I think he has links to the Virginia Harrisons, who were slaveholders in that state. He migrates westward, and before the Civil War, he is in Denver, Colorado. He ran a saloon called the Criterion Saloon in Denver. Was a gambler and also a pistolier and gunman, and killed a number of people in Denver. He shot a black man there for being black. So he's an ardent supporter of slavery. They raised the stars and bars over the Criterion Saloon right after the outbreak of the war. And Harrison and his friends are booted out of Denver. They're run out of town by the pro-Union people there. So He was known to carry his favorite weapons were pearl-handled. That's not a pearl-handled revolver, but that's a Navy Colt revolver of the Civil War era. And so Harrison had served as a bushwhacker in Missouri. He was basically a contemporary of William Quantrell and Bloody Bill Anderson and people like that. He's not an especially effective guerrilla, though. I found one case where he and his riders were over in Missouri, and apparently there was a battle near Centralia, Missouri, where he was supposed to provide aid, and he and his column, they were off joyriding, or they didn't show up when they were needed. So you don't get the impression he's conventionally a very effective officer. But apparently people thought in the Confederate command that he would be good to, maybe they're throwing him away too. Maybe he's expendable. It's like, that guy, send him out west. Also, he had been west. He had been in Colorado before. So he knows some people out there. I think that's why they chose him. And so these 22 Confederates were in disguise, probably wearing blue coats. Probably the rest of their gear was standard Confederate stuff. And the plan is to ride through the Osage Diminished Reserve, through the Osage Nation, and then get out to western Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico. That's a big mistake, to try to ride through the Osage lands without being detected in disguise. Apparently, the Confederates during the war regularly sent scouts north in disguise, sometimes disguised as Union cavalry, and sometimes apparently disguised as Indians. And there's a number of sources that say the Osage thought this was really funny. They would pick these guys up immediately. They're some of the best trackers, I think, in the 19th century on the plains. So they would notice tracks and other signs that these were people who didn't belong there. And the Osage would follow these people and just sort of watching what they're doing with amusement. And some of the various Osage bands that do this, some of them, if you didn't do anything offensive, they would let you just leave Osage territory without molesting you. Others would stop you, or, whoever it was, and basically be intimidating enough to get gifts. It's like, in other words, anything you have, we want. And once they had relieved you of your horse, your weapons, food, whatever you had, then they would turn these guys around and tell them to walk back to Indian territory. And so, that's a regular practice. They apparently didn't kill them, which is miraculous, because they are invading Osage territory, but they would take what they wanted and turn them around and send them south again. So that's what Colonel Harrison and his men are trying to do, is slip through Osage land. There's some reason to believe that they thought that maybe the Osage were buffalo hunting. They're wrong. They were back from that, so they're there and vigilant. There's also a dispute about which direction they came. Some sources say they came up the Verdigris River from Oklahoma, from Indian Territory. I don't think that makes sense. I think they probably came from Missouri, probably from Jasper County. The direction that they're headed, if you were headed west toward the high plains, why would you go north into Osage territory and then make a turn off to the west? And the actual unfolding battle or conflict, to me, indicates they were probably headed straight west across Osage land. But they were somewhere in the vicinity of maybe a few miles to the west of Oswego. Again, they're leaving all kinds of evidence of their passing, and 10 Osage found their trail. One of the things that would indicate that they were basically interlopers on Osage land was that the droppings of their horses would have grain in them because they're feeding like grain. They're not grazing them on the grass. So things like that, leaving behind, places where you made fireplaces and other things. Apparently it was evident that they were there. And so 10 Osage confront Harrison and his 22 men. They're led by the band chief I wrote about, Wahisaki. They're dressed in blue coats. The Osage aren't sure who they are initially. And so they asked them, and they said that they were Union irregular cavalry. But the Osage knew every single man up in Humboldt by facial recognition. They knew all of them. These guys are strangers. And so initially the Osage suggested, just ride with us. Let's all go up to Humboldt, and we'll determine exactly who you are and whether you're supposed to be here or not. That was not acceptable to the Confederates. They didn't want to go up to where the Kansas 9th Cavalry was. So at first they refused. Apparently one of the Confederates panicked, and he drew a pistol and shot an Osage. That was fatal. They wouldn't have been harmed. They might have become prisoners of war, but they would have survived. They killed an Osage. The other 9 men retreated, and nearby was a village of Pas Soleil, or Big Hills, who were the largest individual division of the Osage Nation at that time. Roughly 200 Osage warriors turn out to pursue the Confederates. And the descriptions of the unfolding fight, apparently the Confederates didn't initially retreat at top speed like they should have. Apparently they thought that, oh well, we got away with that. Bad move. But shortly, Osage appear, not just in their rear, but flanking them on either side. And this has been described as kind of like the way you would hunt buffalo. They're directing them straight westward toward the Verdigris River that has steep bluffs where you can't get through with your horse, and they trap them there. And so then a firefight results. There were cottonwood trees, lots of cover, and that allowed the Indians, the Osage, to get closer and closer and pick these men off. And eventually, 20 are killed, 2 managed to get away. They hid down in the canyon of the river they managed to hide, I guess, under the banks of the Verdigris, and they weren't noticed, and they managed to limp. And it's important, they limp back to Missouri. They don't go down to Indian Territory. I think they came from Missouri originally. So these 2 men bring the tale of what happened back to their colleagues back in Missouri. The Osage scalped the dead, which was traditional. They also cut off their heads and put them on posts. That's good signage, like, don't do this. But then they were suddenly concerned. They weren't sure absolutely that these weren't pro-Union men. So they sent 2 riders up to Humboldt to summon the Kansas Union Cavalry to come say, there's been a fight. We need to know if we did the right thing. And apparently they recover papers that the Confederate officers had on them, which later on are turned over. They're blood-stained, but they confirmed the mission of these men. They were supposed to head west to Colorado and New Mexico. This is one of the survivors, Colonel Warner Lewis. He's one of the ones who walked back to Missouri and told the story later. He survives the Civil War, but his son in Missouri later went into politics, and I think he might have kind of died of a broken heart. His son ran for governor in Missouri as a Republican, the party of Lincoln. So after all that work, your kids turn on you like that. What they didn't find among the dead Confederates was any money. They were apparently carrying a purse of gold with them. The Osage knew what gold was, and they reported didn't see anything like that. The Osage also got all their horses, which apparently were high quality. So following this battle in May of '63, 85% or so of all the Osage are staunchly on the side of the Union. There's my band chief who tried to talk the Confederates peacefully into going to Humboldt. In the wake of this battle, he becomes the chief counselor of Whitehair or Pawhuska, who was the principal chief of the Osage at that time. So his political star is kind of rising at that point in time. Here are the Union cavalry who come and found they found the bodies. They buried them along the banks of the Verdigris River and recovered whatever evidence there was of this mission. Their commander was a man named Willoughby Doudna. He was originally from Chitopa, and he was a Quaker. When they burned down his house, he gave up pacifism. So I think a lot of those people, in that time period, things got vicious enough, people who normally wouldn't serve in a military conflict, they do. So that particular Quaker decided to fight. Also following the battle, about 200 Osage that had been riding with Stan Watie, the Confederate Cherokee general, they show up in Fort Scott and volunteer to serve the Union. And there was an entire regiment for a time of Osage. That regiment is disbanded. The Osage didn't take to military discipline and regimentation so well. They didn't see the need to march or do any of these foolish things. And they also didn't like the uniforms they were issued. They're like, we like our own clothes better. So most of those Cherokee are ultimately disbanded, but they still serve as irregulars. Also in the newspapers at this time, Union militia in Kansas were not doing well, fighting Confederate bushwhackers. And you see newspaper articles saying that finally we have a force in Kansas that can basically fight for the Union. The Osage, that maybe what we need, Westport up in Kansas City had been raided by Confederates, saying what we need is a regiment of Osages. because I guess the Anglo-Americans weren't doing so well at that point in time. And the Indians seemed to be a resource that can be harnessed for the Union. Also during the Civil War, about 1,900 refugees came north from Indian Territory and lived on Osage land out in the vicinity of Sedgwick County near modern-day Wichita. And those included all those Indian nations. The Wichitas were the largest number, but almost 2,000 people. If you know about that period, you know there were other like Creek refugees who went to the area around Fort Scott and lived in desperate conditions there. So the Osage actually they allowed these people to hunt and basically garden and survive on Osage land. And so that was kind of an act of generosity by the Osage, who were not in great shape themselves in the same period. So, even though the Civil War is going on, the authorities still want the Osage out of Kansas. There had been a steady push for Osage land. Jim Lane, who was a senator from Kansas, tried to get a bill passed by the Senate in 1863, basically seizing Osage lands in Kansas. He explained that the Osage, in effect, he implied that they created a power vacuum, that they weren't defending the frontier with the Confederate South good enough, and that therefore we should take their land. Really, people just wanted the land. Then in 1865, Neosho and Labette counties are ceded in the Canville Treaty, so another chunk of Osage territory is taken over by the whites. And so already kind of the writing is on the wall. As the war ends, people are flooding into what's now Montgomery County, where I live, the Independence area. Settlers arrive on the banks of the Verdigris. It's illegal for them to be there. They don't care. The state of Kansas makes it clear that they will not eject these people, that the Osage are not going to get any help in preserving their rights to their federally designated reservation. Within, what is it, 2.5 years, you have the Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad trying to broker its own treaty with the Osage. Their goal was basically to seize much of southern Kansas for the railroad, and they were offering 35 cents an acre, which is a fraction of what that land was worth. That treaty was never ratified by the United States Congress, mainly because of the uproar of white settlers. They're like, the railroad is beating us to the land that we deserve. So it wasn't that anyone cared about the Osage. It was that the railroad is railroading the rest of us by seizing this territory for a song. And so ultimately, the final removal of the Osage occurs in 1870. Again, no gratitude for supporting the Union. After the war is over with, basically it seems like everyone is intent on getting the Osage removed to a reservation out of Kansas. The Drum Creek Treaty is the one that ultimately removes the Osage, and they receive $1.25 per acre, a lot better than 35 cents. But within a year of removal, roughly another 10% of the Osage Nation is dead. There's also a mistake that's made. Rather than moving the Osage to their proper location for their reservation, they move them like maybe 4 or 5 miles too far east on Cherokee land. And so a year later, they had to tell them, by the way, the houses that you're building and the fences and everything, forget about it, you need to move again. So it's just one of those bureaucratic bunglings that occurs. While the Osage don't get much for siding with the Union, the majority of them, there was 2 bands, the Black Dog and Claremore bands, that were the furthest south. They were reliably Confederate to the end. But again, 85% of the Osages side with the Union. That probably saves them in a certain respect from punishment. They might have just lost their land entirely without any compensation at all, but still, it's very limited payback for being loyal to the Union. And by 1868 or so, the Osage are literally going hungry. They're owed land or owed money rather for the lands they had sold earlier, but the federal government wouldn't release annuities. So you have this kind of paradox that Indians who have potentially millions of dollars on account with the federal government are starving. And it's at that point, oops, that's not really the map I wanted, but this shows where the Osage are at war's end along the Verdigris River. And there's a couple of more villages further south, but again, the population is, by this point in time, down to like 3,500 or so. This area is near the site of Independence, Kansas, where I live. Locals paid Chief Chitopa a total of about $50 or something at a rate of 1.8 cents an acre for 16,000 acres, totally illegal. People were making these deals. You know, the federal government doesn't allow you to just make your own treaties with Indians, but that was going on. And apparently at that point in time, much of that area is overrun by settlers. And I always use the analogy, it's sort of like I'm trying to get you to sell your house, and before we cut a deal, I move in. You already have thousands of white people living on Osage land, and the Osage are told, you better make a deal or you'll get nothing. Also, all the game in the area was shot by settlers. There's nothing left to eat. And this is the time period when you have Laura Ingalls Wilder and the Little House on the Prairie. They're also squatters on Osage land as well. And later on, I think Laura Ingalls Wilder tried to argue that they were just maybe a mile or two inside the line. They're right in the middle of the Osage Reserve. So there are people today who try to make the argument that the Osage were given an equitable deal, and clearly the circumstances are totally unfair. So, in 1868, the Osage again provide military assistance to the federal government. There's George Armstrong Custer was fighting against the Cheyenne in his winter campaign, and the trouble is finding the Cheyenne. The plan was to attack them while there was deep snow on the ground and they wouldn't be expecting an attack. And Custer's target is the encampment of Black Kettle, which was located on the Washita down just over the Kansas line into Oklahoma. And 13 of these Osage scouts are recruited, including Hard Rope, the chief that I wrote about. The reason the Osage, I think, provided the help was, first of all, they had a beef with the Plains Indians, including the Cheyenne, that were preventing them from hunting buffalo. So they had been restricted from access for their twice-a-year hunts on the western or high plains in western Kansas. Also, the Army immediately agreed to provide food. So once these 13 scouts signed up, immediately flour and other supplies were delivered to their villages. And they were also paid and given horses and modern weaponry. And what follows is a gruesome episode. Custer's men, with Osage help, find Black Kettle's encampment, and they slaughter men, women, and children. It's another one of these massacres. But Custer wouldn't have found Black Kettle's camp without Osage help, and at least one of these scouts reputedly stayed in the Federal Scout Service, and his name was Trotter among the English and English speakers, and apparently he went to the Little Bighorn and survived. He and a Pawnee scout had grown their hair long. Usually the Osage wore just like a top knot and shaved their heads, and so these two warriors working as scouts had allowed their hair to grow long and put it up under their cavalry hats. And when things went bad at the Little Bighorn, they took off the hats and let the hair fall down. And they survived by doing that.